Several of our speakers today have already referred to the great crisis surrounding the Syrian civil war. Our next speaker has been Foreign Minister of Syria, is now a leading figure in the opposition in Syria. I'd like to introduce Riad Hijab.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jim. I wasn't a foreign minister, I was a prime minister. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for providing me with the opportunity to speak before you today. This conference is held in light of political escalation in Syria that led to the demise of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, along with the quasi-total destruction of the Syrian infrastructure, forced displacement, and the rise of extremism among groups at the transnational level. All of these events affect international security because we see the problem of asylum exacerbate in several countries in the world, especially with the advent of ISIS, which has become one of the main threats faced by our world today. Meanwhile, the Syrian people suffer from the failure of the international community in putting an end to the flagrant and blatant violations committed by parties in the war, namely the Syrian regime. This escalation, led by the Syrian regime and its Iranian and Russian allies, is impacting the international sphere. The Washington-Moscow deal is aimed at avoiding the repetition of the Ukrainian scenario in Syria, in particular in light of the new President Trump in the United States, which means that the Syrian situation will be handled differently than the Obama administration. The international community and the Security Council also condemned the acts committed by the Syrian regime. At the same time, the European Union threatened to impose sanctions on Russia in case the latter continued the escalation of military operations in Syria. At the same time, the Turkish position will have a very remarkable influence on the situation, namely in terms of providing safe asylum to civilians. At the same time, the accession of the new United States Secretary General will hopefully bring more optimism and efficiency and effectiveness to the solution process, in spite of the Russian veto. Events in the region are not only affecting Syria and Iraq, but the world as a whole. And for that, it is worth mentioning in this framework that the fight waged by the Syrian people is not limited to its fight against the Syrian or Assad regime, that remains strongly attached to power in the country in spite of its absolute loss of control. And today, the Syrian people find themselves in the midst of an existential fight for survival in order to maintain the Syrian infrastructure, the Syrian system and state, while protecting its institutions from foreign intervention, which has turned the civil war in Syria to a regional proxy war with the participation of tens of terrorist militias and mercenaries from various countries in the world. In light of the escalation of military operations in Syria, it is necessary to reiterate that the humanitarian crisis in Syria cannot be addressed separately from the situation in the Arab world. It is impossible for Syrians to fight for their freedom from extremist ideologies alone. The international community must play an active role in assisting the Syrian regime, the Syrian people, in finding a solution to the crisis and thus putting an end to the bloodshed and violations committed against the Syrian people before the eyes of the international community. Ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian opposition is participating in the international war on terrorism, namely by fighting terrorist groups in the country in order to put an end to forced displacement and massacres. These extremist groups have become incubators for the frustrated youth. We cannot win this war only by trying to reduce or limit aerial attacks against certain regions. The war against terrorism is a comprehensive war that we lead through several programs that we have worked on since the establishment of our entity. We must face extremist ideology along with our military operations. This is a cultural war just as much as it is a military one. Our war must be waged through our society in order to push away extremist ideologies and by providing safe havens to refugees, guaranteeing their return to their country while adopting anti-extremism programs and protecting the rights of citizens under the title of the collective national identity. We also must work at the economic level through reconstruction, the rehabilitation of the infrastructure, while promoting the rights of all citizens equally. We must also work on promoting state institutions in the country which would promote regional and international security. In order to achieve that, the Higher Negotiations Committee has established a vision for the transition process pronounced in Geneva in 2012, and all of the relevant international documents must be aimed at establishing a new system based on the principles of citizenship, accountability, transparency, and the rule of law, while reaffirming the role of the army and armed forces, while guaranteeing the autonomy and independence of the country and protecting public rights. The body, at the same time, is working on establishing a transition committee that would guarantee a successful transition process that would put an end to violations committed by the Assad regime while maintaining the integrity of Syrian territory and guaranteeing the continued work of state institutions. We were keen on ensuring that this vision would not be limited to certain state institutions, but in order for it to represent the aspirations of the Syrian people as a whole. This is possible through by reviewing the Syrian constitution and holding presidential and parliamentary elections that would guarantee a successful transition process. To that end, the United Nations must create a new vision that rectifies the mistakes committed during the past rounds, and this is possible through establishing an adequate environment for the implementation of international resolutions, namely humanitarian elements, in order to put an end to the exchange of fire and release all those who are detained by the regime. This would help guarantee a successful political transition that goes in line with international resolutions, namely the 2012 Geneva Convention, while reaching an effective political agreement. The Syrian crisis is no longer limited to the Syrian people, but it is now linked to the world as a whole. This war, at its core, is a war between backwardness and progress. This is a war where there is no room to find middle ground with our enemies. Western countries have realized that it is no longer acceptable to remain tolerant of these extremist groups. The biggest example of which is several wars that were waged in the past and that led to large-scale and widespread destruction in Syria, Ukraine, and other hotspots in the world. These coalitions find themselves in the midst of a civilizational war against extremism, against authoritarianism. This requires firm political positions similar to the Eisenhower principle in order to guarantee the success of moderate and fair powers in the face of evil. In spite of the challenges we are facing today, we are working tirelessly to translate the aspirations of the Syrian people to reality. The Commission is working on restoring state institutions through external expansion projects while establishing a roadmap for the transition process held in hand with all Syrians who have sacrificed greatly in order to free themselves of dictatorship and the faces of hatred and extremism in order to gain their independence. Thank you very much.
I think I had to ask you to clarify one point, and that is simply you referred to the Washington-Moscow deal on Syria. Can you tell us exactly what you mean and what your understanding is of whether something like that will continue to exist under President Trump?
الحقيقة أنا ذكرت إنه
I mentioned that this deal was stopped. Negotiations stopped between both countries due to the stubborn Russian position that does not respond to international agreements. Russia now is waging an extermination and an extreme war against civilians and the territory as a whole. As for the current administration, the administration was confused and had an ambiguous position, knowing that President Obama, since year one, said that the Assad regime has lost its legitimacy, having committed war crimes against the Syrian people. However, unfortunately, the American administration did not take the necessary steps to put an end to the suffering endured by the Syrian people. President Obama established the red lines, mentioning that if the Syrian regime uses chemical weapons, knowing that the Syrian regime killed thousands and tens of thousands with the use of chemical weapons through toxic gases and explosive barrels, and even until this day, while I am amongst you today, the Syrian people is suffering from bombardment, from aerial raids by the Syrian regime, by Russian planes and others. However, unfortunately, the administration did not do what is required of it, and this is not limited to the American administration, but all relevant states, namely permanent members in the International Security Council. There is an ongoing veto by the Russian government that was pronounced 5 times in order to hamper the work of the Security Council, and we hope that the upcoming American administration will be serious in putting an end to the suffering of the Syrian people and in guaranteeing a successful political transition which would put an end to the rule of these criminals who have killed thousands of Syrians and who are threatening security and stability in the region.